Jill. We work at Joining Vision and Action, a Colorado-based consulting firm working to support social change makers in pursuit of their mission. We are honored to be facilitating the today and upcoming session. It is a pleasure to see you all here and have again a full house on this our second event. We will like to start by thanking you for the great feedback that we received from our first session. Your feedback is always very, very helpful for us. Here are some of the keywords that you said: networking, having space to share experiences and challenges, and great discussion. To honor this, on our third week, we will be making time for networking. And we need all of you to share so we can have the best experience. Also, we would like to remind you about the great opportunity your organization can have to apply for $2,000 grants available at the end of our last workshop on February 5th. To walk us through some of the basic guidelines for our session today, I'm going to turn it over to Jill. Jill?
Thanks, Cynthia. Good morning, everyone. So just to quickly touch on, again, just some reminders around housekeeping. You probably noticed that upon entry, you were automatically muted. So a couple of ways to be unmuted that I will run through here in a moment to let us know. Again, hoping to hear sort of robust conversation as we go through the day and kind of build up upon the momentum that was gained last week. So the features that you should see on your screen, the first, if you just hover over your window and zoom, one is chat feature. That is a way to open a box. You can communicate, share ideas, insert questions that can be shared with the full group, or just you can kind of identify a specific individual. The other icon is the raise hand icon. So that is another way to let us know that you would like to speak at a given point, and we can give you that opportunity. The other is something called Q&A. This is a feature that you're welcome to use throughout the presentations. If you insert a question using the Q&A feature, it will just go to us as the panelists. That said, I think for all of those features, be prepared to potentially be unmuted so that we can hear your voice. That said, if you do wish to remain anonymous in your question, go ahead and indicate that, chat specifically us, the panelists, or you have that option in the Q&A feature, and we can share your question with the presenters. Presentations today, we have 4 of them. They'll last about 30 minutes. And then again, feel free to post your comments and questions as the presentations are occurring. And we will keep track and make sure that we then save time at the end of the presentations, about 10-15 minutes, to have a conversation. Because of our packed agenda today, we don't have any embedded breaks, but again, we invite you to please take care of yourself. There will be those transition periods in between the speakers. The other feature you'll notice throughout the day is something that we'll use called polling. There will be a couple of polls that we'll put up, and we'll ask for your participation that way as well. So with all of those housekeeping pieces out of the way, I'm going to toss it back to Cynthia. Oh, Cynthia, you might be muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you. For our first discussion, we would like to hear your voices and invite you all to participate by raising your hand so we can unmute you. When you think about the topics we're going to discuss today, social media, data analysis and visualization, data security, and social justice apps, what is one of your biggest challenges or concerns? Please feel free to start raising your hands so we can mute you. You can also write in the chat if you like. I will go and post the question in the chat so we can all have it to read it.
Erin, I noticed you raised your hand. Thanks for being willing to share. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself. Erin, are you there? There you are, Aaron.
Oh, sorry, this is Rebecca.
Oh, yeah.
I need to change my I don't know that I can do it, but yeah, this is Rebecca Zuniga from the Denver Justice and Peace Committee. Thank you for having us today.
Right.
So
I think you should be able to. I can go ahead and change it for you. As well.
okay. Thanks.
Okay.
When you think about the topics that we're going to discuss today, the social media and all that, what is your biggest challenge or concern? So we have one now, condensed messaging on all the work we do for bridging the gap. And messaging that works for a diverse audience. Protecting people's privacy, we're gonna talk a lot about that today. Okay. If you would like to share your voice, let us know so we can mute you. Trying to figure out how to engage more folks. Yes, definitely. How to protect people telling their stories from doxing. The effectiveness of social media for our social justice work.
Cynthia, I'm seeing hand raised from Jordan.
This is actually Piper. Jordan's also on the call. Sorry.
Hi, Piper. Hi, Jordan. Go ahead, Piper.
I'll get off and rejoin in a sec for my own account. Just like kind of building on some of the other points people have already raised, like how can what are effective ways to sort of plan out, okay, we know we want to talk about this issue and sort of almost do like an educational series or a series that builds people's awareness and is sort of an on-ramp to action or to deeper knowledge, like instead of just trying to hit the mark with like repeated one-off posts, which is sort of what we do right now.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Piper. Yeah, I think that's a really valid point and question.
So Kevin is sharing getting tactics for making educational content engaging and entertaining. That is something that at the school it's very needed right now, and we see teachers really working on trying to engage not only the students, but also the parents, the family. Okay, so Heidi's sharing, making sure staff have time for data collection and then having time to organize and visualize it. Also protecting privacy and limited technology access for our participants. Very important. Something we talked at our first time about the privacy and the uses of technology, right? Okay, ethical storytelling that encourages action beyond just the share. Not contributing to apathy responses, but communication that gathers action. Great sharing, everybody. Thank you. Nobody raising hands. Please feel free to share with the group if you like. Okay, some of us face negative mental health from being on social media. Okay, wait, where are you? Here it is. All the time. How do we balance the time we need to communicate on these platforms on our health and well-being? Well, I think that we will leave some time to keep reading our chat, but now I'm going to pass it to Tim.
Yeah, well, thank you, Cynthia. Thanks for everybody for being here again today. My name is Tim Receiver from Peace Tech Lab, and it's great to be with you on the road to equal justice in Colorado. I see a few new names on the call today, so just to let you know, Peace Tech Lab, we are a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and we're located on the campus of the U.S. Institute of Peace. Our mission is to explore the ways to use media, data, and technology to prevent violent conflict all over the world. And this workshop series, this is our second workshop in Colorado this week. And it's our newest program called the Road to Equal Justice. And we're running this program in 16 cities across the United States. We started in Baltimore late last year, and Denver is our second stop. We're going to be going to Boston and Miami next, and doing 16 cities over the next year. And you know, as we're looking at this, we all know the resource issues that come with working for nonprofits. Some of the comments in the, that you were posting just now kind of shows that time and money are in short supply, staffing is in short supply for most of us. And for Peace Tech Lab, we hope these workshops we hope they can help you to achieve greater efficiency and scale some of the great work you're doing using low-cost media, data, technology tools, and some new strategies. The sessions that we picked over the next couple weeks are built around the information you sent us in the pre-event survey. So what was important to you? And today's sessions will include presentations and discussions on social media strategies, on data analysis and visualization tools, on something we saw last week, which was digital security, protecting your identities online, protecting your data online. And finally, the end of today will be around social justice apps that are off the shelf that you can use in your work. Next week, we're going to be looking at storytelling, the importance of storytelling, of media strategies, of interview techniques with the media, survey design and deployment, and a few other topics. And Cynthia mentioned this earlier, but we have about 3 $2,000 grants to give to get some small technology pilot projects off the ground once we conclude next week. And I can promise you the application process is very simple. We'll share that with you after the end of next week. But the process can help you with integrating technology. We can also help you with buying some of the software licenses for some of the tools that we've been demonstrating over the last couple weeks. And finally, I'd like to recognize our partners at the law firm Hogan Lovells who've helped us make this workshop series a reality. I'd also like to thank Dr. Bernard Amadei, who is the vice chairman of the Peace Tech Lab Board of Directors, but he also helped raise funds to make this possible in memory of his wife, Robin. So now with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Denver's own Joining Vision in Action, Jill and Cynthia. Thank you, and over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Tim. Again, we're just thrilled to have everybody with us today. And I think just reviewing all the challenges as they came in, I think a lot of those will be touched upon in today's conversations. And again, we'll invite you as we get to the Q&A to kind of revisit those challenges and questions as our presenters are sharing their expertise with us. So our first presenter, before we pop it over to her, I am just going to post a poll real quick. And we'll just ask you all to take just a few seconds. I'm trying to launch the poll. Doesn't seem to be launching.
Can you see it now, Jill, or no?
Let's try again. Yeah, it's just grayed out.
Huh.
Okay.
Well, we can move on. We'll
Yeah,
figure.
let's skip this poll. Oh, there it is. Can everybody see it now? Perfect. Okay, so just take about 10 seconds to respond to those questions. Let's take a few more seconds and we'll close it. All right. So just sort of reflecting on the results, right? We can see that about 2/3 of you do have a social media strategy, with the rest just either unsure or not specifically having kind of an explicit strategy. And then agreement around other in terms of one of the most challenging parts of the social media strategy. So as we get into hearing from Nicole and having an opportunity to have conversation, would love people to be able to kind of expand upon that. Great. Okay. So I now have the honor of introducing our speaker, Nicole Schmiedl. So Nicole has 6+ years experience working with digital content creation and strategy. And in her most recent role at the North Face, she was responsible for managing the global social media team. While there, she grew the brand's audience to 13 million and saw a 226% growth rate on Instagram alone. So Nicole will be sharing platform overviews, how to build content strategy, as well as how to manage accounts. So with that, Nicole, I will toss it to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Jill. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to virtually be with you today. And thank you so much for the time. As mentioned, and I think as a lot of us were talking in the chat earlier, managing a social account these days is extremely difficult. And so I just want to acknowledge all of you guys for, your hard work behind it, and knowing that it does take a mental toll at times. So kudos to all of you. I'm actually just working really quickly on being able to share my screen. I'm just working through the, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to. Is there a preference end on the host side?
I think we already checked that box to allow panelists to share.
Awesome. Great.
Okay.
Wonderful. And then, obviously, if we were all together in person, would definitely love for this to be more of a dialogue versus me sharing out. So I'll kind of change my presentation a little bit based on that survey that we just did, and would love to spend a lot of time. It seems like some key themes that came up were actually, telling authentic stories on social and choosing which platforms to do that. And then making sure that we're able to analyze the impact of that, as well as maintain everyone's just mental health in doing so. So we'll kind of open it up at the end for more conversation and discussion around that. So today I want to just kind of give you an overview on how I've approached social strategy, with the caveat that there are so many different ways to approach it, depending on the brand and the relationship that you've really built with that community. So this is just, some of the learnings that I've used over the past 4 years at the North Face that I wanted to share with you guys. So I think it's really important to remember that social is a part of your digital marketing ecosystem. It is not the end all be all. Granted, we have moved to having, significant relationships built in social, given, the current situation with, the pandemic. But I do want to remind you guys that there are so many other tools that can be used as well. So social is a part of it. It's not your end all be all online communication tool. From there, I wanted to just kind of dive into some of the key platforms that I've been utilizing and really just give you guys a top line overview of what I've found best for our organization, with the caveat that, it obviously depends on, what your objectives are for your organization, what your audience is looking for there, and that these platforms, as we all know, are changing ever so quickly. And evolving. So what might have worked yesterday might not always work tomorrow. And that is the, blessing and curse of working in social, is that it's always moving and always changing. I also wanted to caveat too, that the more that you build a relationship with your audience on the platforms and get to know who they are and what type of content resonates, that'll also affect what channels you're going to be on. So Twitter, what I've found that works typically best for that is because it's not as visual of a platform, engaging in cultural conversation and industry relevant updates. So this is really, an opportunity for your organization to participate in conversations that correspond with your organization and your values. Instagram being a highly visual platform, my goal with this one has actually been used to engage. They are continually making platform updates to engage with members on that community. So while pushing content out is great, I've also found it to be a really great tool to actually engage with, other kind of industry members, potentially, members of your organization, and things like that too goes a really long way in building a strong connection between your organization and your consumers. Facebook is actually one that I have, after looking at our declining growth rates, actually kind of taken a step back and haven't prioritized it as much for a few reasons. It's been harder to moderate content, which I'll dive into in a little bit. And we're just seeing that our growth rates have declined. So we've really started to use Facebook and ask ourselves, okay, we have an audience there. How can we use that tool that's going to be best for our bandwidth and give our consumers, still a added benefit there. So we've really taken a step back, and our primary uses for it is to kind of use our page almost as you would a Yelp page. So it hosts information, but we're not proactively pushing out information. When in-person events were happening, it was also a decent tool for events. However, with a lot of our events going virtual, we decided to actually move that event platform onto our own site. Pinterest is one that is really interesting because they have seen an increased surge of active users in response to the pandemic. People are using it as an escapism hub. And it's one that I like to think of as a way to, create inspiration that doesn't always need to be your own organization's content, but it can be relevant themes or values that your organization believes in. What's interesting about Pinterest too is that it's a relatively, I would say, low lift platform that continues to get decent engagement and keep our brand top of mind just due to the algorithm. YouTube is one that we've used for quite some time now. We use it to host our long form videos, and we really use it to inform the video content that we're making by looking at our keywords that are associated with our brand and using it to increase our SEO. In addition to that, when the pandemic hit, we also used it to create more timely, relevant content using their live platform feature, which I'll kind of touch on later when I talk about key vendors and technologies. And then lastly, TikTok. This one I'll say I was a little bit more apprehensive on joining yet another platform to moderate and understand. This one, however, I think can be best used for educational content, reaching a younger demographic, and at this point, also providing some light and humor when done correctly. Cool. Next off, knowing that so many of you guys already seem to have decent strategies in place, I'd actually like to kind of skim over this one relatively quickly. But I do want to touch on one important pillar that I recently added that I actually really believe that any organization or brand that's on social media should have. And this is going to kind of correspond with some of our conversations around mental health and boundaries and creating a community reflective of the values that our organizations have. And that's creating community guidelines. So like any relationship, you're going to set clear boundaries and expectations. And unfortunately, because we're not getting some of that guidance from the social platforms themselves, I found it really valuable to actually create my own set of them for that audience, to make sure that whatever content we're putting out, that it's a safe environment, people feel supported, that there's no harmful, hurtful, or threatening comments, and that if we do receive negative comments that aren't within our community guidelines, we have an action plan, and that those expectations are clearly stated for our audience. So I'm happy to go into further depth with this too. And I think, trying to see if there's been any questions roll through.
Yeah, Nicole, I think there is actually a question if you want to take a moment.
Awesome.
Yeah. So it's from Miranda. Miranda, I am going to just allow you to ask your question directly.
Thank you. So yeah, I think as I was looking at the channels and the ones that you've prioritized, also what popped into my head, and I'm sure what a lot of us have to consider, is just the makeup, the demographics of the audiences that we are attempting to serve through those channels. Just because I know for certain folks, I know some of my audience, they don't have an Instagram account, or they've turned away from Twitter. So I just wanted to see if you had some advice in terms of, when you're determining what channels to prioritize, are you also just kind of thinking about the audiences that you are trying to engage in those conversations?
Yeah, definitely. I would say, so kind of we have a pretty comprehensive strategy. I like to say that we make a lot of data informed decisions. And so really, in order to figure out that strategy, we've done channel audits yearly, and I kind of do always just ongoing channel audits where we look at our audience on each channel, the growth of that audience on each channel, the lowest and top performing posts. That way we can better understand what content's resonating with that audience on the channel. And then when we do go into creating content, we'll use a lot of that information to inform which platforms we want to prioritize there too. But that's a great call out, Miranda. I think I'm going to move on from this one unless anyone else has any other questions just around creating their strategy. I actually wanted to give you guys an example of how I approached our Spring 21 strategy too, just to kind of open it up for conversation too. And granted, it's about a 64-page deck, so I just pulled some top line insights there, primarily to show that I try to make it as relatable as possible. And really do things that are, I guess, tangible, that are taking into consideration where everyone's at these days, and making sure that we're just being really considerate of how broad our audience is too. So here's just, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of an insight into how I approached our strategy and some things that I was thinking about as I built it out. I'm going to keep this pretty top line, but I wanted to just give this as an example. From there, these are kind of the key content categories that I'd identified for us. The next steps that I had done is actually breaking out for each content category, which platform corresponded with that, as well as the one key objective and what we were trying to achieve there. From there, I then would create content calendars just to map out and plan out, what our cadence is, to make sure that we didn't have too many messages going on at one time. And then also looking at really key moments that were going on to make sure that we didn't have any situations where potentially we were not keeping into consideration cultural events at that time. So moving on from there, once we have, our content strategy, we've briefed in content publishing, I think, is really great. What I'm more concerned with these days is actually moderation and engaging. So making sure that our audience, when they do respond to our channels, they're heard, and that we can communicate with them in a two-way conversation. That's what makes social media so unique. And then also making sure that if there are situations, we are upholding our community guidelines. So we are actively monitoring in case there is something, and this really ties back into authentic storytelling. We want to make sure that individuals that are represented on our channels feel supported, even if there is a negative, comment or situation on that. We have that obligation and commitment. That active monitoring is one of the top priorities these days. From there, I just wanted to kind of give you guys an overview of some ways that we measure the success depending on what the objective is of that content. I'm going to kind of just touch on the few key ones that I'm really interested in these days, being engagement rate. So looking at, your total audience and seeing out of that total number, what percentage is engaging in your content? Because that's a really great indicator to see if that content's really, making sense for this audience and actually learning from them too, which is where we kind of go into engagement sentiment. So you can actually look and break down, was it positively received? Was it negative? Was it just kind of neutral? And learn from the language that your audiences use and incorporate that into future marketing campaigns too. And I'm going to just open up the Q&A. So it looks like Jennifer had a quick question. Tips for posts that invite two-way conversation. That's a great question, Jennifer. Did you have anything else that you wanted to expand there before I answer?
Just that I feel like we get a fair amount of shares and reactions, but even when we ask a question, we often don't get much of a response. And so I've just been thinking more about that one of our goals is to engage people in conversation in person and on social media. And it kind of feels like the conversation, maybe it's because we're just preaching to the choir, but or maybe looking at ways to expand outside of our host pages to reach other audiences to get that two-way conversation started is maybe a second part of that question.
That's a great question. Well, I'll say without knowing much about your organization or your audiences on the channels, a few things come to mind. There are so many different tools to engage in two-way conversation. So for example, utilizing Instagram stories, question features, or even polls is technically a way to engage in two-way conversation. In addition to that, there's also your organization proactively commenting and engaging on industry, threads or posts as well. So I would say experimenting a little bit. Luckily for us, I think Instagram is a really great platform for engaging in that two-way conversation because they have built in so many different tools depending on your comfort level on that channel to engage, whether it be reacting to a story, to resharing on your story a post. There's so many opportunities, I would say, depending on your comfort level on that channel, that I would try to experiment a little bit. And then it looks like Danny asked, we are an all-volunteer organization, so time to develop and maintain a strategy is a challenge. I hear you on that. Are social media platforms that you would suggest prioritizing just to cast large a net as possible? That's a great question, Danny. Do you have anything else that you want to include before I kind of dive into that?
Not necessarily, just the fact that, I think probably like everyone else on this call, time is a very diminishing thing we all have. So we tend to almost kind of react with any content that we might post as opposed to being proactive. And again, that's part of the challenge with, not really investing in a strategy or putting having the ability to really invest in a strategy. So I think that'd be the other piece, is that a lot of what we do is also I'd almost say reactionary versus being kind of proactive and thoughtful.
And honestly, I've heard this so many times and experienced this too. My just personal philosophy there is I would rather, set a goal of 2 posts a week. Make sure that content and message is strong and that you feel good and that it represents your organization. And then, you know, take that time to monitor and start with a goal that's achievable. And then I would pick, you know, taking a little bit of time and look at your platforms and your audience and looking at that, you know, growth, and especially like looking at engagement, prioritizing one platform and doing it really well. The more active, you know, that you are on that platform, you'll continue due to the algorithm to see it being populated more. I think social can become overwhelming really quickly because there are so many platforms that I would recommend, you know, choosing one and doing it really well, and letting the others kind of just subside at the time. That's always worked really well for me while at North Face, actually. And that's actually how I was able to build our Instagram, is I looked at our growth trajectory on that one platform and prioritized that, with secondary being our YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Hopefully that helped. Okay, cool. Then I wanted to talk about this a little bit because it seemed like in the initial survey, there were quite a few conversations and just questions around measurement of social and tools that you can use just to help understand your impact a little bit. So I wanted to just share a few of them that I've personally used and give concrete examples of it, while mentioning that there are so many other competitors within this space. So Google Analytics, as you guys all know, you know, you can measure your site traffic. I actually really like to look at keywords too, associated with the brand or organization. This really helps inform what types of content people think of when they associate it with the brand or organization. And that'll definitely help inform your content strategy too, because that's what they're looking for. So you can easily provide it for them. The second one that, you know, we haven't talked too much about is user-generated content. So as we all know, we all consume and create content. There are so many great ways to make sure that you can aggregate that content that, whether it be a participant or member of your organization, has created, and utilize that on your site and social and build really strong relationships. There are tools out there to do that. If you don't want to manually source that, one of them that I particularly loved using is Curate. So it actually allows you to source, make sure that you have the rights, and communicate with that person to make sure that you're able to use that content both on site and social. Thirdly, I think, as you know, a lot of us observed, live streaming had, you know, become increasingly a powerful content tool. However, I would say it's starting to diminish a little bit more due to, there was a huge spike, and then there was actually some data that supported that there was a bit of a live fatigue. But I do still think it's a really powerful tool, especially when it comes to events that you might not be able to be present at, such as speaking events or athletic events, things like that too. We do have a vendor that helps with that allows you to do multi-platform streaming, and that's Social Live. The benefits of that is that you can produce it as well as stream to multiple platforms, and actually, you know, have a concrete saved, produced video for other uses as well. And then there are so many great social vendor tools out there that actually take a lot of the pressure away from, you know, content planning, publishing, reporting, and even helping with that moderation and engagement. I've, you know, done an RFP and worked with a lot of them to try to determine, you know, which ones have some of the best capabilities. And the one that I support is Sprinkler, just because they have the capability to do social listening and are just really up to date on a lot of the best practices there. And then from there, I actually wanted to turn it around to some questions, since I know that there had been some really great ones that had come through the chat, and try to have a little bit more of an open dialogue conversation.
Great, thanks, Nicole. I think there was a comment in the chat that perhaps we can have the person share, elaborate a little bit. It's kind of a good idea.
Was it Miranda?
ladies, are you, this is Miranda, are you asking me to share the comment I made?
Yeah, I think if you could share it to make sure everybody caught it, and then if Nicole has anything to kind of elaborate on other strategies.
Yeah. So one of the things I think that we realized that was slightly working against us is just how algorithms work, and how, especially with Facebook more specifically, and probably Instagram as well, you can't even reach your full audience unless people are engaging with your posts. And so what we realized, and what has become an advantage to us that we try to be strategic about, is when we know that we have content that we want to drop, that we want to gain a big following for, or that we want to have more engagement with, we start by prepping our internal audiences. So like our board members, our committee members, our volunteers, our participants, we actually send out communication to them, and we talk to them, via email, or we have conversations with them during our meetings where we're regularly meeting, to let them know about the date in which we are going to drop that very important content, and ask them to just engage with it, share it, like it, comment on it. And we tell them that just by doing that, they actually open up those algorithms for us and actually get us farther advanced in those posts. And so they feel like that's a way that they can actually help us and further our reach. And when we do that, we are a lot more successful with even engaging folks beyond them, so that our posts gain more reach, or our content gains more reach. And so we've been pretty successful with that approach.
That's a great call, Miranda.
So again, invite everyone to use chat, the Q&A feature, or to raise your hand. And as we're waiting for some of those comments and questions to come in, Nicole, question for you is, what advice would you give for organizations looking to start a social media strategy or to create one?
It's a really great question. I think it all comes back to relationship building, and looking at what your organization's mission and values are, and just expanding that to a social audience. So, it is a human to human interaction tool, and that's what makes social so special, is making sure that, I think there's a tendency to, be a bit more apprehensive sometimes when you're doing social on behalf of a brand, but it is building relationships, and it's an opportunity to be a bit more personable there.
Cynthia, you're muted.
I'm sorry about that. Any more comments or questions from anybody?
Yeah, seeing a question here in the Q&A for you, Nicole, from Jennifer Piper.
Yeah, sure thing. Hi, Jennifer. So social listening is a really great tool that it allows you to kind of do twofolds, but better understand what your audience is saying about your organization, keywords, what the overall sentiment is. And then it's also a really great tool to look at your industry or marketplace and competitors as well. So I'll typically use it if there is kind of twofold for always on, just to make sure that I can kind of see what the relevancy is. And then as well as when there are specific either campaign or more crisis related moments, just to better understand kind of what the key themes are. And then as well as, how we can better address and moderate that too. And, we use Sprinkler for that. And it just kind of helps us get a better pulse of how we're doing in relation to our competitors in that marketplace.
So it's kind of like in those crisis moments, maybe a way to see what other people are saying on a new for us as organizers, a new policy or something that's in the news what the conversation already is, and maybe how we can add or echo things that reflect our values or our position.
Yeah, exactly. And also just better understand what key concerns are.
Yeah.
So sharing an example, there were some key concerns about our sustainability at one point. So we were able to pick up on that and proactively message our sustainability commitments. So it can be a bit of a kind of crisis, kind of not, yeah, kind of a crisis moderation technique too, I would say. And then I just saw your second question.
Sorry, I have lots of questions.
A little bit.
Yeah, like, so we all on this call work in social justice directly. And so I think that sometimes I have concerns about how to make sure we're being authentic. Or one of the barriers for me to use some of these data and like dig into all of this stuff you've been discussing that's very strategic and makes sense to me is like wanting to make sure that we're continuing to be authentic and connect, like in the social media work that we're doing. And so I know some of the values and the plan that you use probably help you as a guidepost to stay authentic and not just end up where the data lead you, where, because our goal isn't necessarily like the biggest audience. It's, engaging people in this change process.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe other folks on the call too might have an answer for how you've done it. I'm just starting to be more of a planner around our social media work. And that's what comes up for me. And I'm like, I don't want to just be like selling whatever people are buying for social justice work, because part of our job is to challenge people, if that makes sense. It's like this tension between bringing people in and challenging them.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I feel like kind of my guide post for that has always just been like you're a vehicle for communication over social and storytelling. That yes, data informs that, but it informs. It doesn't always lead and guide it too. So a lot of it is, making sure that it does feel right and on brand, and that all parties, whether it be you're sharing someone's story, feels comfortable with how it's being depicted in the narration of it. Or sometimes it can also be used to give your channel over to amplify someone else's voice completely. And so there are different kind of tools, I would say, depending on what that content is, and how to best share it out, if that helps.
So Nicole, we have another question here in the Q&A box, and it says, what were the reasons for the slowing down on your Facebook engagement?
That's a great question. We weren't prioritizing that channel. We had been seeing that our growth had kind of plateaued on it. Whereas at the time we had seen growth continually month over month, positively grow on Instagram, as well as our audience, I would say skewed on the engagement, slightly more negative. And so we kind of made the conscious decision to prioritize Instagram as a channel over Facebook, given that engagement's one of our organization's goals, and one of my personal goals with the community is I want to make sure that it's an engaged audience that feels as though they see themselves reflected in the brand and have the ability to participate in conversations with the brand too.
Thank you. I see, Carla, you just posted in our chat a question. Would you like to please share it with the group?
Yes, thank you. So in my experience, it does seem that social listening and moderating is a really, really good tool for brands or organizations that have a really large following, because there is a lot of engagement and you can do a lot of that work there. But currently our audience is rather small and we have a smaller following. Would you recommend prioritizing something else other than like moderating and social listening in that case?
I think I would. Hi, Carla, by the way. Nice to see you over chat. Yeah, I think if your, audience is a little bit smaller, I'd probably prioritize like partnerships to help growth, you know, and kind of seeing, you know, which organization or which individuals that you potentially would want to story tell, and focusing on content creation and generation to grow that channel first. I think would make a lot of sense there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hey, Miranda. Yeah, I would love to speak to this. I think there's a lot of power in amplifying the voices of others on your channel. And, you know, a lot of that can be done with just relationship building and partnership building. And it's actually a really great way to make sure that the narrative is reflective of that individual story that you want to tell, because it's coming from their first voice versus, I would say, kind of content in my experience previously has come from a second or third voice. So it's typically done through just a relationship building process. And I always like to give a brief to make sure that it is, you know, consistent with your organization's guidelines, and kind of all formulated similarly, especially when it comes to creative. But it's a really powerful tool that I can encourage anyone to try.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank you, Nicole, for your presentation, your insights.
I'm sorry, Cynthia, I hate to, Nicole, can we keep you just for a few more minutes? I think there were a couple of challenges that came up earlier today that related to this specifically, and you've touched on a couple of them. And I think one was around this idea of community guidelines. And you mentioned like skewing negatively on Facebook, but kind of making sure that you're establishing those community guidelines. Can you provide a little bit of advice about how to kind of create that and stay on top of it? And then the final point I saw earlier was around the mental health, the well-being, sort of the balance that needs to exist when engaging in social media.
Yeah, sure thing. So honestly, community guidelines is something that I actually haven't heard many other brands doing. It was something that I needed to initiate because we have these values of being inclusive, you know, of being accepting, of working on creating a more equitable outdoors. However, we were seeing an extreme kind of uptick of negative, hurtful, harmful comments that weren't in accordance to those values. And they were really, you know, awful, honestly. And so we needed to do something to set some boundaries. If that was, you know, indeed and is our mission, we needed to make sure that our online community represented that too, and that it wasn't just representative of our internal workforce and our day-to-day actions, but that our external community on social media was aware of those values and knew how they could interact with our platform proactively. And if, you know, there were negative comments that weren't in accordance to that, how they would be addressed. And so I drafted up, you know, an article of, you know, on each platform when they come up. I'll walk you guys through Instagrams, and it's published online publicly. So that way anyone can view it and see what those guidelines are. And so for Instagram, for example, if someone posts something that's, you know, threatening or harmful or discredits someone's experience, that comment will be removed from our online public profile, and then they'll be given a DM. So that way they're held accountable and recognize why it was, with a link to our community guidelines and outlining how they can proactively, you know, interact with our channel at that time. And I would say it's a really hard one to measure. I would say kind of internally it feels good, and it also helps, believe it or not, kind of the mental health aspect of it, because over time it helps create, you know, a community that is supportive, that respects one another, and, you know, can kind of lead to positive, constructive conversations versus ones that just don't need to be had. So
Great, thank you. And do you have any sort of final words of advice around sort of the mental health, the well-being of sort of the individual's side of things when doing this work?
yeah, definitely. I think first and foremost, you know, your mental health is so important. And taking the time and space away from social, it is always going to be on. And so setting really hard boundaries or guidelines on when you are participating on social. And I touched on it a little bit, but a really decent example that worked well for me was if you need to reduce the cadence of your post in order to make sure that you can spend that hour or two moderating after to ensure that there's positive conversation, that's okay. And making sure that, I think there's this interesting notion right now of consumption over creation. It's really easy to spend a lot of time consuming content over creating it. And just being, I would say, aware of that, and really setting those hard boundaries of how long you're spending on social and how you're going to interact with your audience there too. So, but kudos to all of you guys, because I acknowledge some of the challenges that we all currently face in social these days, but there's also a lot of, I would say, positive joy that comes from being able to connect on such a broad scale that social provides too. So yeah, kudos.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. We really appreciate your time and feedback. And I know folks were kind of chatting along the way about an interest in seeing slides and hearing the recording. So just a reminder to everyone that this is being recorded and it will be available.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Nicole.
Bye.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for your engagement on that. I think it's really interesting. And now we're going to kind of pivot over to talking about data analysis and visualization tools. So before we make the introduction to our next speaker, just going to pop a poll up. Hopefully it works this time. So you should now see a poll on your screen just around data visualization. So if you just want to take a few moments to respond. All right, give folks just about 10 more seconds to respond, and we'll close this. So just sharing out the results now, can see kind of about split in terms of whether people indicate being comfortable or uncomfortable. I think also a comment saying about being comfortable doing it, but falling to the wayside, so not doing it necessarily. And then reflecting on what you use data visualization for around communications and strategy and reporting. Wonderful, good. Okay, so I think we'll have a lot of these topics further covered by our next speaker. So now I'm going to introduce Behar Xharra. So Behar has worked at the intersection of technology, public policy, and security. Behar has led innovation, data analytics, program design, strategic growth, policy programming, and capacity building for organizations around the world. Behar is one of the co-founders of Keshif, a data analytics and visualization company, and serves as its chief operating officer. So with that, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Jill. Can you hear me? Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be a part of this event or workshop, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session when I get to hear directly from you, both feedback wise and also what may work or what may be your needs. I'll share my screen briefly, and then sorry. All right, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Very good. Oh, Yeah, so I'm going to take a more practical approach rather than a theoretical approach when it comes to data analysis and visualizations. The idea is that by the end of my 15 to 20-minute presentation, you will know a few resources that you could use on your own very quickly. Go from being a an amateur to a data viz. Well, not exactly, but something. My idea or my goal is that by the end of this presentation, you'll really be able to find platforms that can help you navigate with data, communicate with them, or even use them internally, that you mentioned as one of your priorities for strategy. Well, when I looked at the pre-workshop findings from the survey that the Peace Tech Lab had run, when asked about the biggest barriers that you have in terms of data analysis and visualization, it was basically it's too expensive, too hard to learn, and the last one, hard to find talent. Yes, that's always the case with every technology, with every undertaking. And as scopes become more complex, analysis goals become complex, applications become more complex, need become more complex, and of course, all of these stand true. However, what we have now in the industry, we have more specialization and kind of democratization of tools where non-data savvy individuals can also start interacting with data or make use of data visualizations. Think of it, phone apps, one phone app does a function very well. So that's where also, not just with data visualization industry, but most of the industries, it's, those self-service driven type of platforms springing up and becoming better and better for the user, but also for the analysts. So with that in mind, I will briefly just go over, what Google search will give you in a result, why analyze and visualize data. I think based on the survey, we understood very well where your priorities are, strategy and communications. And I think we don't need to go beyond that. I just want to quickly, draw your attention to this very nice a graphic that tells a story, right? Data on its own, it's data, right? Once you start putting some flavor to it, it becomes information. When you start connecting the dots, it's knowledge. And then, when you look at what stands out, what are the anomalies? So these are insights that can help, that this knowledge or data can drive you to. And then the rest is, going to the unknowns and be able to generate, I guess in this case, wisdom. Briefly on the process with data. So anytime you're working with data, as with every methodology of work, also when it comes to data, you have that in place. So first, think about finding the data. Is it the right data? Is it complete? Is it well prepared? Is it structured? Is it biased? Right? Come up with the goals. What is the goal of the analysis, right? That is, design the methodology. Everything starts there. Once you have the data, once you have the methodology, or maybe once you have the methodology, you can collect the data through survey tools or other forms. Then once you have the data, there's always a need to clean and prepare them. There is a cliche here, garbage in, garbage out in the data industry. So basically whatever the input is, the output cannot be expected to be better. So if the data is unstructured, if the data is not, it has a lot of gaps, what we can expect is, visualizations with gaps. So visualizations are not, they can be beautiful, they can paint a picture, but the picture is not going to be accurate if the data is not accurate, or if the data is not structured, then the picture will be broken. Once that is done, right, we go into analysis. So that's the third kind of pillar in the data lifecycle, right? We have to ask the questions, find the answers using data, lead to further questions as we start, looking from, different perspectives and variables. And then, just go on, explore data, to reach that wisdom, right? To come up with insights beyond just one result or one hypothesis. And that, I guess, moves me to finding trends and insights. And then at the end is basically, once you have all these pillars taken care of, then you move on to communications, which seemed like majority of you consider that as important, right? How can you leverage data to tell stories, to communicate, whatever you may, whatever mission you may be trying to drive, or the impact that you're trying to reach within your communities or within specific types of goals. Sorry, before finding data, the first one was finding an idea and setting goals. So we can kind of go back in the loop. So right now I will just go briefly through maybe about 10 to 15 examples or applications that are out there for you to just go and use right away, and start, by using, you learn. There's always templates, there's always documentation in each of these platforms that can really guide you through the use. Are you going to be advanced data scientists using these tools? Well, no, but can you come up with, because that requires, of course, training and going beyond just, using a tool, but can it solve problems that you may be facing, or not problems, but goals that you may have? Yes. So first comes first, I highly recommend datavisproject.com. Basically, this is a website that has tens of graphs, right? And it helps you really visually start becoming familiar with, oh, Sankey diagram. A Sankey diagram is this. And what are the different variables or the data types that need to go into it to produce a Sankey diagram, right? What is a bubble chart? What is a pie chart, et cetera, et cetera. So this will be kind of the initial stage where you go and you become familiar with, based on the type of data that you have, what kind of charts you may be able to get. And then there's tools that can help you transform the different data types into visualizations, dashboards, interactive dashboards, exploratory analytics tools, etc. And I am going to list here a few. There is there's hundreds of tools out there. I just chose some that I'm more familiar and that I've seen with civil societies worldwide. They are easier to begin with or to make use of. So first comes first, right? We all know Excel. We all use Excel, and a lot can be done with Excel, right? And then rows and columns. This is where you go. You put the data in. You start managing them. You start, or you can clean them, prepare them, and keep them in a in a format that is well structured. So then for the visualization process, that life becomes much easier. We usually undermine that and we say, oh, we don't have big data, we cannot do much with that. An Excel data set with 20 rows and a few columns can still bring a lot of insights. So don't undermine the size of data, and then kind of the power that it can have in terms of understanding certain outcomes and results. Alternatives are Google Sheets, if you're in the Google ecosystem, where you can collaborate online. Excel Online does the same, or Airtable. It's a bit more, it's kind of the next level type of spreadsheet platform where you can connect multiple spreadsheets, where you can, it's a bit more visual. There's hundreds of templates, some for even wedding management, to surveys, to if I saw someone, for example, is trying to always solicit information from your alumni. So these are good tools to really be able to, manage the data, but also collect data and be able to structure them. And then once you have the data, there's tools like Infogram or Pictochart. They have hundreds, like Airtable, there are hundreds of templates where you can really do infographics, beautiful infographics, and at the end, you know, you export that into an online platform. So all these tools have freemium, what we call free use for public data, with, you know, some logo and some limitations, and then there is premium where you pay for it to get more services or more capabilities within you know, in those tools. For example, what you see here, I believe this is from Infogram. It's a US map, right? To go, let's say, into Oregon or into, you know, Denver, kind of you know, a more granular type of maps, that's where you may need to pay. So that's what it's premium versus freemium. But they really require little or no knowledge of data analytics. So long as you have the data, they give you a template, you add the information pertaining to your subject, and then you'll be able to generate charts, figures, text, and really be able to communicate with your audiences and your networks. Then there is, you know, charting tools. So kind of this is the second level of you know, where you move from infographics into more interactive tools. Flourish, it's up and coming, and it's a platform that a lot of media are beginning to use. Flourish has, of course, it's a template driven or a chart driven platform. For example, if you're following elections, they give you specific sets of charts. If you're doing, you know, analytics on events, there are other charts, etc. The same is with Data Wrapper. Really, they follow the kind of the same chart-driven flow. Then you have charting tools that have hundreds of features within, where you can bring together charts to develop dashboards. These usually require individuals to, you know, the learning curve could be a bit higher. There's a lot of trials and errors, but as you use and as you become more familiar, then there is a lot of opportunities. So kind of market leaders, Tableau, Power BI, Click, and Google Studio, it's picking up more and more. Then you have more interactive exploration analytics, also dashboards, but what we call, you know, the ability to interact with data from different perspectives and have less decisions in the design process. So that's where we fit. So us as Keshif, and Jill made that introduction earlier, that's where we specialize, right? Each of these tools has advantages and disadvantages. Our advantage is in quick to go into visualizations, but also highly interactive charts that enable exploratory analytics. So you don't need to have a hypothesis to go and find an answer. Of course, it's good to have it, but the idea of exploratory analytics is that where you go and you explore the data, you come up with questions, you find answers as you're exploring the data. The other thing that we do as Keshif is, you know, we take our technology and we custom deploy it and design it to meet certain needs of customers. That's where, for example, we partner with different organizations, anything from the UN into you know, US government agencies or nonprofits, and then we build these tools, including what was mentioned as a need in the survey, you know, mapping out alumni and surveying them and evaluating, you know, how they're getting engaged with the organization, etc. Another tool is exploratory.io, where you will be able to do similar, to get similar outcomes, but may require a bit more skill. Then you have mapping tools like Cardo and Mapbox. I think I may be coming close to time, but these are tools that are specialized in building different mapping layers and features and visualizations, not per se dashboards. You can get a map dashboard, but you know, the maps are what you know, what is the core of their strength, and you know, there is, you know, different levels of expertise can get different outcomes out of these tools. Network analysis. So if you're looking into explicit relationships between one entity and another, one person and another, then, you know, these are, or if you're looking, for example, what is, you know, what is the information landscape using a Twitter hashtag, right? Who are the influencers there? Who are they connected with, etc. So there's good tools like Node Excel that has all these direct integrators with platforms like Twitter. There's Kumo, which is more like you go and you build your own network in there, and then Cytoscape, where you can do different types of visualizations. There are a lot of others, but I think these could be the ones that will require less, you know, getting you into network analysis. The process will be simpler than other tools. And then, you know, word clouds. This is really these are very simple, but simple but effective types of charts. I've seen a lot of organizations, you know, take a text or take a speech of someone and be able to generate a word map, right? So then you see, for example, developed was used the most, and then educated or free used the least, etc. You know, so basically, depending on the amount of times a word was used, then you get that corresponding to the size. So Word It Out or Wordlet, these are two known tools. These are all free, and you'll be able to just plug in any text in there and generate these kind of word clouds. I have a live example with Keshif that I could show you. It's not a Denver-based type of example, but it's the way we look at it is basically what is the data type? So it's an events data, basically who, what, when, where. Or an incident database. So if you think of if you are looking into the number of arrests that are being made and where and what kind of impact are having, etc., or protests around Denver area, etc. Right? So then I will go into here. This is about aid workers security worldwide. As I said, it may not relate directly to your subjects, but the data is really, the data type is really what we see a lot of nonprofits focus on. So basically what we see in here is, and this is a Keshif dashboard, right? So it has different types of charts that show results of incidents. So we have 2,600 incidents in the past 20 years or so that have happened or taken place against aid workers in different countries with different means and have attached different variables. And then here's the map, right? So we look, these are what we call a cluster maps, right? So there is a latitude and longitude. So every incident is one point in the map, but when there are more incidents in one area, then they become larger kind of bubbles. So the idea is, how can we start analyzing something like this, right? Let's say we just want to focus what I see, I guess, South Sudan. I'm sorry, again, it's not a US-based data set or example, but it's just to give you an idea. Then we can see that of 276 incidents that happen in South Sudan, most of them have been happening in the past 4 years, with the highest in 2018. If I bring the mouse on hover here and if I see 91 of these incidents have happened on the road, and then you can see how in every single chart, they're the same kind of click insight highlights. So for example, of 91 incidents that happened on the road, 53 involved shootings and 82 of them involved ambushes. Or we can compare them, right? So for example, quickly, I can just assign a color to each of these variables, and then I can see, for example, in shootings, the highest is in roads, unknowns, and public. Or in bodily assault, the highest is in public location. And then here, if you look at the map, I guess this is the capital area, and then you see a breakdown on what happened in the capital area. And you can go from overview all the way to detail. You can see text each and learn about every single individual. You can go from absolute numbers, right? What you see 91 into percentages, so relative to each other, how many, etc. Anyway, so I will stop it here and I will move into the Q&A for the sake of time.
Great. Thank you, Behar. So I think to start, so one of the questions that we asked at the beginning was around just people's greatest challenge specific to these areas. And there were two folks that I'm going to prompt. So kind of talking about the issue between sort of accuracy and storytelling. So Ryan and then the individual from Great Education, Colorado. I'm wondering if maybe we could start with Ryan if you want to kind of elaborate on the challenge, and then we can toss it to whoever is with us from Great Education, Colorado.
Excuse me, so the issues as far as data visualization go?
Yeah, as you were talking, your biggest challenge around sort of, accuracy.
Yeah, and so the sort of idea is, garbage data in, garbage data out, and it's difficult when you have a lot of different patients who might be, not literate, and just making sure that the data we have is reflective of, what's actually happening, and what sort of tools can you use to make sure that you're not getting weird variances or things like that, and making sure that, the data that you're collecting is reflective of what your population is really experiencing.
No, that's a very, very good question, Ryan. So I guess there the two initial or some of the two pillars that I mentioned there, right? This comes to, I guess, once you know what you're asking them, then no matter their level of skill, there are ways, for example, in the data collection forms, you create as many kind of limited structures that you only give them options, right? So the user goes only and clicks on an option. For example, the survey that was just that just popped up here at the beginning of my session, right? It had options. So when you give the user only options that are structured and all they have to do is click on one rather than have to type free text, then that makes the data much more structured once it's collected, and it's much easier to to be able afterwards in the post-election process to work with that data, right? There, we work with clients that do a lot of paper-based surveying, so that makes it a bit more difficult. And yes, there is a range of issues that you may find at the data level, but then there is always the data cleaning preparation process. So that's kind of after data collection that what comes in. And really, we realize in our work that most of the effort is put in data collection and data preparation rather than data visualization. Maybe because we were the experts and we have a technology, etc. But really, if the fundamentals are not in place, it's much harder to to have a flowable process afterwards. So always make sure that when you're at the stage of when you collect data, create as many structured information and flows as possible so the user or the clients or the patients don't have much free text that they can write, right? They have only options to choose. And second is afterwards, make sure that there is a in-depth review and cleaning process.
Thank you.
Great, and I think sort of potentially related, this question from Great Education Colorado around sort of how do you take, I don't want to paraphrase, but it was sort of around the broad audience and being able to communicate potentially complicated information. And I don't know if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, sorry. I don't know how to change my name on here. My name's Nicole. And yeah, I do work for Great Education Colorado. We disseminate a lot of information, mostly around like Colorado public education policy. So when we do data points and data sets and things like that, it's really difficult for us to also convey like succinct definitions of policies and things like that. I was just wondering if there's any tips.
That's a difficult one. And yes, I mean, again, data can help you, tell stories. But then there's always, what story do you tell? Do you want the audience to only interact with one chart that you control the insight, or do you want to give them more power to the analysis? Do they go, where they can see the same information from different perspectives? So it really depends on that. But usually what we see as an effective tool to communicate, more basic information is infographics, where you can have a set of results that you think are important to convey the message that you have, and they require only a set of aggregate level results. I think that's the way to go. If you want the user to really be able to have more independence and go through, interact with the data to get insights on their own, to reach their own conclusions, then you think more on dashboarding tools and exploratory analytics tools like what we do. So highly recommend you do check out Infogram and Pictochart. It really, they make life much easier. And PowerPoint at the end of the day is not bad either. I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I have one anonymous attendee that asked a Q&A question here. But before that, Carly shared in the beginning of our presentation a question: how to protect their stories, how to protect people telling their stories from doxing. So maybe this can be follow-up questions after this one, and then we will go to the anonymous.
Can you repeat again? Sorry, I think I lost you.
Sure. So her question was how to protect people telling their stories from doxing.
Yeah, so more of in the privacy aspect of it, right? So I think, in USAID Speak, where we work a lot with clients that implement USAID, there's the do no harm policy, right? We go and provide services to beneficiaries, in different places. And then we leverage their experiences to understand what is the impact of the work we're doing, right? But there is a do no harm policy, right? Let's make sure we do not tell who said what, right? And there is many ways to go about that, really. It's at a data methodology level. So if you're designing the database, or if you're designing the questionnaire, how can you ensure through the questionnaire that as much of it is not biased and it doesn't lead to identifying an individual? Because you can say, here is a presentation of 200 people we surveyed in this neighborhood in Denver, right? And then of these 200 people, 5 of them have big houses, 5 of them have, small houses, and then the rest have apartments. So in a way, you can deductively go back and try to find who are these 5 houses, and then kind of start guessing that actually it's people from these 5 big houses that have said something. So really, at the design stage, it really requires a lot of thinking on how the data can be, as clear, but also not trying to identify an individual. Then we have now more and more, for example, for quality assurance purposes, that the interviews are recorded, right? So how do you keep that out? Or the location of where you held the interview, like the latitude and longitude, is recorded as well. So how can you make sure that that does not bring harm, or does not, come in conflict with the privacy of the individual that is providing the information, right? Or names, and then we have the PIIs, et cetera, right? The personal information. So at the design stage, that's one very good place to start. But then also the data, once the data is collected, even if you're collecting personal information, once you come to a point of, presenting insights to the public, then at the data preparation level, that's where you put aside private information. And then at the data visualization, that's where you generalize as much as you can, right? So there is, in every single pillar of the data lifecycle, there needs to be work done to protect the privacy of individuals, if that's kind of the goal.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to read the next question. Can you explain the network analysis tools? What type of results could we see with these tools?
All right. So I mean, it may not be the right example for you, but let's say we worked with one client on individuals that radicalized in the US. Both, the right movement and the left, or the Islamic movement, etc. So what they did is they did research on public records. So they went into courts, public media, etc. So then they started identifying people. Someone, attacked a church, or someone tried to blow up a van in Times Square, etc. Right? So when they're looking into information, into courts, they were putting a lot of information for each specific individual. And then one of those areas where they're trying to sue is, who did they know and who did they collaborate with? So these were the explicit relationships between these individuals. So this individual knew another one that traveled to Syria, or knew another person that was an influencer in social media, or knew another person that, was building bombs at home, etc. I'm sorry, maybe I'm talking about very operational, or very like a topic that may not be very appropriate, but this is kind of an example that we worked on. So then what happens in the visualization side is you create these link and node and charts or maps of individuals. So every individual is a node. It's like a circle, right? And then you say, show me these circles by age. And then, so the older you are, the bigger the circle becomes. Or show me by number of attacks or attempts to attacks, then the circle, right? And then what you see is not just the size of the bubble, but you see how this dot connects to this other dot. And then you create groups. So then once you're doing analysis, you can say, wow, so I can think of, this group versus this other group versus this other group. And here is what it means. This group has gone more into Syria, or this group has gone more into like local attacks, etc. So this is what would be a node, a network analysis. There are other examples. Sorry, I think someone wanted to say something. Tim.
Oh, no, that was me. Go ahead and finish your thought. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. But there's other examples where when you're doing research, for example, how, let's say you're working on community housing, right? So you can see, you start mapping out institutions and how they interact with one another. So there's nonprofits that advocate for certain policies. And then there is organizations that manage certain policies and budgets for, community housing. And then you start linking. So this nonprofit collaborated with this institution to provide this many grants to this many families. So each family is a dot. Each institution, each nonprofit is a dot, and then each grant giving institution or managing institution from the local government is a dot. So how are all these dots connected?
Yeah, and I was just gonna echo that, Behar, for the network analysis tools. I would say, Peace Tech Lab, we were looking for peace builders in communities, and I'll just give one example. The Node XL tool that you mentioned. We were analyzing the Charlottesville hashtags after the riots that were going on in Charlottesville a few years back, and running those hashtags through, and then looking for those connectors of, this is what everybody's saying on Twitter. Here is the kind of the angry mob, and here are the people they're preaching peace and moderation. And this, you could see the overlaps of who people listen to on both sides. So you could find those people that could actually connect, and it would be a credible voice in the community potentially, to kind of look at stopping the violence there. So that's, anyway, something we've been looking at in other communities around the world.
Thanks, Tim. Maybe I got too technical.
No, it's a good example.
Cynthia, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So I think we're going to give the floor to Phantom, that he has some comments to elaborate.
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Fatma, and thanks for that presentation, Behar. I just was making the point that I think it's important, especially for us as social justice organizations, a lot of people here, that, like, for example, we use Tableau, and that any of these sort of systems we're talking about are tools, and where Tableau is like, an analytical engine that's creating the visual analytics and forming it into dashboards for us. That's great. So a lot of these systems are aggregating or disaggregating data or creating them into visual representations, but it's also important to think about how you internally store that, particularly with primary data, so that you own and have it for all intents and purposes, say even that you woke up one day and that company closed down or whatever. So just thinking of how you backend and save your data for yourself in an organization. And that was it. It was just an additional point.
I don't think I have much to add. Great point. And I think, yeah, so you always want to have ownership of your data, and you always want to be able to reutilize them. There's not one tool that, you know, the data have to be, you know, specific to just one tool. You can use different tools to do, you know, to get different outcomes out of it. So very important. And there is, you know, a whole set of data governance aspects to it and how you manage. And then, you know, then you're going to think of internal resources, the talent, who's going to manage, how are we going to create these workflows, what tools are we using to, you know, to store backup in case, you know, one data cloud just goes out, you know, is there a backup? So that's always, these are always decisions that every organization has to keep in mind.
Great. All right. So pivoting a little bit, Kevin, you should be allowed to talk. I just wanted to see if you would be willing to share your question with Behar.
Sure. I was just looking for a brief explanation of what dashboards are, because I know that perhaps some applications might be focused on the users analyzing data through comparing it in different ways, but I was trying to understand if there's tools that also let the general audience interact with the data and look at trends, like you mentioned.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. No, well, dashboard, think of the car. It's a graphical interface that gives you kind of an understanding or of what is happening, right? And I guess if, you know, in the car you have the speedometer, you have the gas, you know, kind of the fuel level, etc. So think of these also all being data points that speak to the dashboard, and the dashboard only displays what's happening with the information. And I think you mentioned a couple of points within that. Sorry, I may not be giving you the most academic definition of dashboards, but that's where you can start with an example. In terms of, you know, user-centric tools, right? We're always trying, as technology or product firms, we're always trying to work with the user to make the end result as easy to use, right? So our mission is to really democratize data in a way, right? How can everyone be able to feel like a data scientist? Not to feel, but to use, actually to interact with data so they can come up with their own insights. So there's always, in the technology field, there's always work being done on simplifying processes. We work with a lot of organizations that are working internationally. For example, we just recently worked on 2 election-based projects or results, one in Uganda, one in Kosovo. And the election data are very, like, you know, they can be from national level to subnational, all the way to ballot box. So how do we create a navigation, an easy navigation through that whole data so that public, you know, members of the public without much data analytics experience can go and get the results? Oh, this person got this much. Oh, I'm going to look at the candidate. I'm going to look at the party. Ah, here is the map where this individual got, you know, votes, et cetera, et cetera. So hyperlocal applications that have thousands of data points about thousands of candidates across thousands of villages and municipalities or districts or hundreds of thousands of polling stations, right? How can, that be easy for the user? So that's how, for example, we spend 1 month, 2 months, 3 months working on, with user and interface designers, with data scientists and software developers to try to simplify the navigation across data.
Okay. I get that and appreciate that ultimate goal. I guess my question was more tailored, or I was trying to ask if the nonprofit strategist is using this data, it's a bit different from posting a link on your Instagram and sending the data to anyone in the public to look at it. Are there platforms that allow your data to be accessed publicly in an interface that anyone can use, and not just the data people in an organization?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, all of these platforms that I presented, right? So they have different goals and lead you to different outcomes. If your data is public, then the visualizations will be public.
Okay.
If your data is private, then visualizations will be accessible only to individuals that have access to the data or the dashboards. Usually, for private data, most of these tools charge, right? That's where there is, the business model comes in to make money, or to bend for the companies or the technologies to benefit from the use. Now, in terms of charts, how easy they become to use, that's, where maybe the public, not just the strategists or analysts, can, come to place. And then, to make these dashboards, that's a different story as well.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and for wrap it up, maybe Miranda, you can talk about the challenge with presented data.
Yeah, so my comment is just that I think I go back to maybe college when I first heard the term, correlation doesn't always mean causation. And I think what I've seen, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, is that a lot of folks will use that aspect of correlation in ways that really have a negative impact, especially on vulnerable populations, to use data against us. And so I think that's what I'm just trying to say in that comment that I made is we can't control how folks interpret data or the way in which they use the data that we create. And so I don't know if you have suggestions for ensuring that in terms of the way that we visualize data, that there something that we can do to ensure that isn't being interpreted and then used in ways that actually harm the populations we're serving.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big conversation, I think, not just in the data science, it's a philosophical conversation, debate. We all have different biasness, come from different backgrounds, see life in different perspectives. That happens the same when we look at the data, right? So one way to go about it is, so, I mean, and it depends on the mission, right? If you want to present just one chart with, results for something and it's static chart, then that's one way to go about presenting the data. If you want to really the data to have the impact, so the users make up their own mind using the data, then that's transparency, right? And anyone can look at the data and come up with the insights that they see. Now, what they do with that data, with that information or insights, what platforms they use to create, their own communications and influence, etc. That is, that's not kind of the goal of data transparency, right? The goal is so that everyone can use data to be more informed or better informed, and then what the results may be. It's beyond. I I don't have an answer. It's an ongoing debate, right? Because sometimes if I get us as a exploratory analytics technology that, we want the same data to be looked at, from different perspectives, and each perspectives will bring an insight about the same data, about the same result, right? That's what we try, that's the mission that we try to bring into the data world, right? But there's others that actually want to control the outcomes or the insights. So then they present just a limited version of it. So it really depends on the goal. And can it be misused? Of course. It's like, in the beginning, we're all, we're all excited about, what the social media is enabling us to do to stay connected, etc. But then we're realizing how then the social media is being used for other, purposes. So the idea is, how can we continue to make sure that, the positive goals, are the ones that we champion.
Thank you so much, Behar, for the presentations, insights, and thoughts around data analysis and visualization tools. Any final words to wrap it up? Behar?
I thought that was to the audience. No, I'd only say, I believe Tim or the team will share the presentation with you as a PDF, where I highly recommend you go and play with, try them. Really, it may be a bit of a learning curve, but really, each of these platforms are continuously becoming easier and easier. So play with it, bring some data that you have, try to see what you can do, because really, these are great tools for you to tell your stories, the work that you're doing, to have the impact that you want to have in the community, to advocate, whatever it may be. So and then if you ever need a consultation, or if you have a project idea, I'm always accessible.
Thank you so much. So now with these final words, I will pass it to Jill.
Thank you.
Thanks, Behar. I think, and just thinking about that cycle you presented in the beginning, kind of thinking through all of those different elements along the way. Tim, did you want to jump in real quick?
No, I just wanted to thank Behar and apologize to the audience, not for Behar. That was an awesome presentation. I would apologize because we usually have the data collection, the survey tools before, like the, kind of the best practices and what Ryan was talking about as well. And we couldn't get her on this week, but Angela from Typeform will be joining us next week to talk about best practices and setting up and distributing surveys. So that kind of all fits into all this, and we'll get you that list of all the tools that Behar recommended. So thank you again, Behar. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good luck. Thank you.
Right. So we are going to kind of now make a transition to talking about data and digital security. In order to make that transition, just going to post a quick poll. We'll take just about 30 seconds to respond before we hear from Trey. Okay, so just about 5 more seconds before we shut it down. And so just seeing, I think, antivirus and malware software being in as one of the top, but also other, and seeing comments in the chat with people indicating that all of the above is sort of the most appropriate answer. So with that, I will transition over to Trey Hanbury. So Trey is joining us today to discuss digital security, your risks and how to protect your data and privacy online. Trey is coming to us from the law firm of Hogan Lovells and brings over 2 decades of extensive legal experience and a deep understanding of technology policy to help solve his clients' most pressing and complex issues. So we also want to do a quick shout out and a thanks to Hogan, Lovells, and Colorado for their support for these workshops. And with that, I will hand it off to Trey.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here and be able to connect with folks, and I'll look forward to the Q&A at the end as well. The presentation I'm about to deliver, it's really focused on the mobile component in particular. So much of our lives now is lived through our phones. I mean, I don't have to look any further than my 15-year-old daughter to know that, but even, for me as well, we use them not just for voice and data connectivity, but for all of our apps, for everything that we do online. Much of it takes place through our phones, which have, this tremendous power to, unlock our doors, but also to, provide us the latest data or order, takeout, whatever. We can do it on our phones. It also, of course, has geolocation data, which adds another dimension. And the first occasion to deliver this presentation came in October, in the midst of widespread protests about around any number of civil injustices that have occurred. And it was really given with the lens of protecting your data security in a protest era. So how do you preserve your personal identity from law enforcement prying into that identity and using it in ways that might be unwanted or improper, and trying to stay out of that environment is really an end to itself. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about what law enforcement can do to get at your data or those folks who are marching under your banner or involved in your movement. But I'm also going to spend a few minutes talking about what they can't do, because oftentimes we think that there's this all-powerful ability to really get under and into our personal data. And there are limits, important limits, to what law enforcement can do, just from a technical point of view, as well as from a legal point of view. And so we'll cover both sides of that coin. And the time shift has been really interesting, because in October, I was really thinking about how do you protect the data from law enforcement. And I was really worried about law enforcement overreach. And with the Capitol riots, and we still have a 2-mile green zone around the Capitol here in Washington, where there's a 7-foot anti-climb fence and 25,000 troops stationed around the Capitol. It's like an occupied territory. We still have that, and now I'm worried a little bit about law enforcement underreach, that they have these tools available and maybe they're not being used enough. So I'll leave it for you to judge about whether we're underreaching or overreaching, but I think it's important that we all have a common sense of what's possible and what's not. And that's what this presentation is really grounded in. So I'll go ahead and pull up the presentation and we'll go from there. So let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. Hopefully. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So first, let's talk about the mobile technology that's available. What can law enforcement do? So if you're at a protest, one thing that law enforcement could do would be to jam your transmission. It's really going to bollocks up your ability to communicate with other people in your group. It would, I think, render any protest, march, or movement much more challenging to do. It is simple, it is effective, it is reliable. It is also unambiguously unlawful. It is expressly prohibited by law. That is true for local law enforcement. It is not true for the federal government. They're not bound by that constraint. But whether it's the sheriff's office or the local police department or any other entity of government or private sector, commercial companies or what have you, banned by law, prisons, what have you, cannot, at least non-federal prisons, cannot jam communications. And if you think about it for a moment, it makes some sense. We rely on these phones for our connection to 911, connection to emergency services. The jamming is indiscriminate. So it's both the desired and the undesired traffic. So you might want to disable the communications for that protest, but it's quite likely you're going to knock out communications in the entire sector, which could be people in an office building or a home or even in a distant location. So federal law is completely unambiguous about that, and there are all sorts of compelling reasons that state, local governments, private citizens like you and me cannot do that. Another big element, of course, is tracking. There is GPS in your phone. That's the global positioning system. We'll talk more about that. There's good reason to have that data. 2/3 of all 911 calls come from cell phones these days, which to me is still an astounding number. I mean, I grew up with wireline phones, and that's still kind of what I think of as a phone. So the thought that 2/3 of that first responder traffic or traffic to the public safety answering points is coming from a mobile phone is still amazing to me. And having accurate location data is critical to law enforcement to know, and to first responders, fire, EMS, to know where they're going to go. And so what we've seen over time is the tracking information, the information about your location has gotten increasingly more accurate. And that's been really led by a series of FCC moves, rules that have created more and more demanding standards that the wireless operators have to meet. And so, whereas before it started out with sort of a 500-meter target, it's grown increasingly narrow to the point where present-day accuracy levels can get you within 50 meters, and there's some move to even get more accurate than that. And a lot of what happens is on an XY axis, so it could tell you latitude and longitude or a street address, for example. But there's a new rule that the FCC adopted recently that will give you the Z axis, the vertical axis as well. And so by 2025, all the major carriers will have to provide that Z axis data too. So we'll be able to tell whether you're on the first floor or the second floor or the 50th floor. And this grows out of a situation, some tragic situations where first responders get to a big building in a major metropolitan area and they don't know. And they have to go floor by floor searching for the person that's had that heart attack because it's unclear what floor they're on. So there are good reasons for that. But that does mean that you can get pinpoint accuracy, or soon we'll be able to, no matter where you are, and have information about what location you're in within your home or within your building. And that might be an uncomfortable bit of data that you don't really know you're sharing, but you are when you're in your what you think is a private setting, whether it's a apartment building or a home. They'll know when you're in your bedroom as opposed to in your living room. That's some of what you get already with the Wi-Fi hotspots. If you think about it, and you're connecting to data via a Wi-Fi hotspot, that Wi-Fi hotspot doesn't travel all that far. It depends on where it's situated and what frequencies it's choosing. But let's say it's 500 meters, 400 meters. Each hotspot is registered to a given location. If we know what hotspot you're accessing, we more or less know where you are and can pinpoint that data depending on exactly how many other hotspots are around. We may be able to even get a good sense of very accurate data because there are other points where we can triangulate your information. So that gives law enforcement a lot of tools to talk about or to identify where folks are. In the presentation, and I don't want to go into too much depth because I probably already have on the first point, this is really just to set out the overall goals, and I want to be mindful of the time too. But I want to talk about data and data aggregation. So the last presentation was really fascinating to me because it's all about getting your data out there. And mine is really to try to keep it in. You want to be in control of what you share and what you don't. And a lot of the techniques and the things that we make our lives easier really do surrender a lot of power and autonomy in our data to third parties. And we may do that unwittingly. And so we'll talk a little bit about how some of that data is used and then aggregated in ways that might be unexpected. Talk about that. And then the last set is fighting back before, during, and after a protest. These are just practical pointers to avoid unwanted detection to law enforcement. And so, and this is part of the interesting thing between October and January. Again, the idea in October was I don't know. I was just looking at law enforcement and they're pulling people out of the crowd or after the fact recognition. And then I saw with the Capitol riots, we saw a lot of these practices used in real time. I mean, everyone knows or is familiar with the guy with the Viking horns, so wearing nondescript clothing is probably a good idea when you go to protest. I mean, I think we all know not to wear Viking horns now, but there's some real practical pointers to avoid unwanted detection. Okay, so let's talk about jamming. Here I give you a few statutory sites. These are straight out of the US Code. I mentioned earlier how they are flatly prohibited. This does not extend to the federal government. They can jam and do, but state and local governments cannot. You cannot, I cannot, commercial businesses cannot. And the FCC takes this very seriously for all the reasons I mentioned at the outset. With the 2/3 of 911 calls coming in via mobile, the jamming does threaten to really upend our public safety communication system, and the FCC takes that very seriously. The tracking I mentioned, and we have seen this progressively improving location accuracy. And here I walk through a few of the location tools, and let me take a minute and talk to you about them. So one way to get at your location is to see what sort of base stations. These are the cell towers that everybody's always arguing about with the, they're unattractive or they're not what you want to have in your backyard. But if we know 3 nearby cell phone locations or base station locations, we can triangulate. We can draw lines from each one, and depending on how long it takes to get from your location to one tower or the other, we can get pretty accurate between 30 and 1,200 meters with that triangulation. That's much better than just the base station, because if you think about it, with just one base station, we're just sort of pinging into the wilderness and we're getting back a response. And we might know directionally that you're east, and we'll know that you're a certain distance away, but we really won't know east, west. We won't know that other dimension of the data of the XY axis. Triangulation gives us the power to identify XY coordinates, but it's a pretty big swag because we're doing mathematical calculations of time of arrival of different signals to different towers. And so you can get a lot of variation depending on what frequencies and how the user is situated. GPS, incredibly powerful tool. These are orbiting, so GPS signals, and forgive me if I kind of geek out here, but there are 31 medium Earth orbit satellites that ping constantly down to Earth, and that timing signal, which is based on an atomic clock aboard the satellite, can give us very accurate information about your location. So it's always getting that signal, and it's signaling how delayed that signal is in it arriving at its location back to the network, which then performs some calculations to identify where you are on the planet. Amazing. We can get within 7.8 meters of your location, but atmospheric attenuation, changing weather conditions, indoor location, if you're in your basement, can limit that accuracy. And so Wi-Fi gives us another tool. Got a lot of indoor Wi-Fi hotspots. They're all registered to a location. We can use those MAC addresses, combine them with GPS coordinates, really drill down. And then we get to the XY Z axis that I mentioned earlier. Your phone actually has a barometer inside of it. We can take barometric readings and understand your elevation above sea level based on that barometric pressure reading. We can use beacons, which are being deployed to meet that FCC standard I mentioned earlier, to really get at elevation above ground. And that information and that computing power that's on your phone and then available in the network will very soon give us the capability to be highly accurate as to location, whether you're on the first floor or the 30th floor, as well as XY axis coordinates that we've had the power to do for some time. So we've seen this progressively improving, and I don't see this trend stopping anytime soon, capacity to really identify where you are located. So we've got a lot of different capabilities that vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Law enforcement in the United States is not a, as you all well know, it's not a national entity. It's not homogenous. It is widely varying from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. They have varying abilities to tap into these tools. 97.8% of the counties can receive, these sort of highly accurate location requests, and then there are progressively higher standards like the Z-axis criteria that I mentioned earlier for elevation that will be available to law enforcement county by county, locality by locality, and there are requirements that are imposed on the operators, the cellular operators, to make it available to a certain percentage of the counties, and then it's up to the counties to sort of take advantage of that resource. Some do, some don't, and it is highly a localized, mostly budget-driven decision for those entities. I think there's a couple of things flashing. I want to make sure I capture, before I go on to the next one, that I capture the questions. Does it work when your phone is off, for example? It depends. When you mean off, like if you're not in a call, absolutely. If your phone is in airplane mode or it's a hard off, no, you're not connected to the network any longer, and you're not transmitting information to or from the phone. And so one of the practical pointers for if you're going to a protest and you don't want to have your location tracked or known, go into airplane mode or turn off your phone with a hard off. And I see some other comments here. I'll pause the comments on this one. This was the comment about tracking devices. Yes, they are tracking devices. There are some safeguards. We'll talk about those in a minute. Yeah, and also I think there's some interesting nexus with vaccines and vaccine distribution. So let us come back to that. Now on to surveilling, sort of how this works. What can be done? What are the tools that are available to law enforcement? So first, it's important to understand how this works. Your phone is assigned currently. Your phone is assigned an IMSI. It's an International Mobile Subscriber Identity Number. It's a 15-digit number that authenticates you to a network. And the way that law enforcement historically has gotten information about people is to Harris Communications. So it's an antenna manufacturer, equipment manufacturer that a lot of carriers use. Harris has produced equipment, they call them Stingrays. They go by a lot of different names, but the most common is Stingrays. These things are pretty cheap. It's $150,000, and they can capture those unique IMSI numbers from wherever they're deployed. So they capture that identity, and then they can trace that back to you, and they can identify then your status. Is your phone, are you on or off call, or who's calling you, who are you calling? They can get the serial number of your phone. They can understand the date, the duration of your call. They're not so much intercepting the traffic itself, but they gain a lot of data about when, where, how, who you're calling. And that can be very useful. The idea is that you're targeting an individual, but these Stingrays are indiscriminate. And you, if you deploy one, the way it works is your cell phone, the way that works is your cell phone transmits to a base station, and the base station communicates to the larger network. Often it's with fiber back to the larger network. And at that point, it works like any other land or wired communications. So the link to your cell tower is really the only wireless part of the call by and large. And the way that a Stingray works is the law enforcement officials will roll up what is basically a phantom or a fake, a pseudo cell, and it will be very strong because it's very close. And your phone will say, oh, there's a very strong base station right here. Let me go to that base station, the one that law enforcement has erected. And law enforcement will then relay that back to the intended base station. But in the meantime, they're going to gather all of the sort of data about who, when, where, how you're calling and capture that. And it's indiscriminate, so they'll know everybody in that area and what their, every IMSI that's there, and then they can trace that back through the carriers to identify who was in the vicinity. That could be a very powerful tool. And one interesting thing about Stingray is it's really a 2G network, and now we're talking about 5G, so this is a couple of generations old. And one of the reasons that it can be used so readily is the 2G networks had very little or no encryption, so they're not very robust. When you get on a 4G network, it's pretty well encrypted. It's kind of hard to eavesdrop on this sort of information, but that same device can actually mimic a poor 4G network experience and downshift your phone to 2G. And then when you're on 2G, then they can get your data again. And so that is, that's part of the reason why the concern, even though we're now, multiple generations out, still exists about these Stingrays and their ability to capture data. And the technology hasn't stood still either. There's now a product called Hailstorm that purports to be able to decrypt, at least at the initial setup, an IMSI-like number, and it gets a bit complicated, but for the initial handshake, they still use some unencrypted data. And if you can get at that, which Hailstorm purports to do, you can unravel the mystery of the identity of those callers. So pretty interesting little sidelight about how that works. As I mentioned, there are supposed to be warrants when you're surveilling individuals. These Stingrays are not discriminate though, so they get you information about everyone in the vicinity, and it is a bit, I think, of a moral hazard in some ways, because you do have quite a bit of information available to you about who was in a given place at a given time. And so I talk here, we can go over these when we have a little bit more time, but there are different types of warrants for different types of oversight or surveillance. But again, the tools that are being deployed are often blunt instruments and not so precise. Okay, on to facial recognition. This is a really another fascinating area about capabilities. And we've got about half of all American adults are in some type of law enforcement facial recognition network. That's another astounding figure. But if you think about it, it's not all that surprising. It's not just mugshots at this point. It's, it is meter readers, it is toll booths, it is fixed cameras on street corners, and it's body worn cameras. We're going to get to that in a bit too. But there is a lot of data out there and a lot of facial data that's been collected over time. And so the other event that has been taking place simultaneous with, and to some degree independent, but increasingly overlapping, there's an incredibly enhanced ability to use algorithms to compare photos that are captured in real time against existing databases. Now, those databases are disaggregated and scattered all over the place, but increasingly they're being knit together in some interesting ways. And the software itself is becoming more accurate, at least for certain types of demographics, much more accurate. If you're, the inaccuracies actually are increased with minorities. They tend to be not as heavily sampled, interestingly. So the error rate, false positives, false negatives can be much increased with minorities who are the subject of this type of comparison than with, say, a white male. But error rates across the board are dropping precipitously. And here I've got a little stat for you. 2010, the error rate was about 8%. And now, at least for majority communities, you're looking at a 0.3% error rate. So there are some limitations. They're really important. Bad lighting, low resolution if you're on your side, as opposed to directly looking into the camera. But the resolution of the cameras are improving. The accuracy of the software is improving. This is not going to go away. I think the interesting or the worrisome thing here is there's almost no oversight. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I look for standards. I look for objective policies that we could have for this technology. There's almost none. There's inconsistent disclosure. There is very few jurisdictions have taken a forward-looking approach there on facial recognition. San Francisco is one that's barred the use of facial recognition as a law enforcement tool, but that is the exception and not the rule. The capabilities of federal law enforcement is generally far superior than local law enforcement. I think local law enforcement has generally seen this technology as beyond its reach. That's changing a little bit, but it's principally been deployed at the federal level. And I think the only concern there, if you're in a protest, is there's a lot of cooperation between federal and local law enforcement. So you can't entirely discount the possibility that law enforcement has access to some powerful tools. And there are a lot of companies that are now marketing to law enforcement tools that have until now been really only available just because of financial considerations to the federal government. Okay, body-worn cameras. And maybe I'll pause before going because I see a couple of comments. Yeah, are landlines more protected from surveillance at this point than mobile calls? I think the interesting thing there is your identity is tied up with your mobile phone. It is a one-to-one relationship, and we can trace that back to you. And if you're calling from a payphone or you're calling from some phone that's not identified back to you, there's a level of anonymity there that can be pretty powerful. And so in that sense, yes, I think there is a greater risk from mobile phones, because it is like advertising your own personal brand and identity every time you step out of the house, and maybe even before you do. So body-worn cameras, fascinating backstory. These were initially pushed as a tool for police accountability. The idea was to, and I quote it here in New York opinion, provide a contemporaneous objective record of law enforcement activity. And the idea was it was going to increase mutual respect. Everybody's going to be on their best behavior. Police will behave better. People who are being stopped are going to behave better. It will dispel distrust. We can look at it. It will be objective, and it will be an unmitigated positive. And this is as late as 2013. And even in 2013, you had 1/3 of law enforcement using body-worn cameras, according to one DOJ study. And that's now, as of 2019, it was 1/2 of all law enforcement using some body-worn cameras. Not all officers, not all the time, varies that by department. Many of them are at the pilot stage, but 1/2 had at least this in their inventory and available to them. And the DOJ back in 2016 found that 9 of the 38, many of them the larger ones, equipment makers who push the body-worn cameras or who market the body-worn cameras to police agencies, law enforcement agencies, incorporate some sort of facial recognition technology. So what we've seen, of course, is that body-worn cameras haven't always instilled the types of values that the court in the Floyd case hoped that it would. It's not always clear that it has led to more mutual respect or lawful interactions or greater trust. And there's some reason to think that a lot of the footage that we've seen, whether we like it or not, however horrifying it might be, might have engendered the exact opposite of what was hoped. We also, of course, have this question about body-worn cameras and combining that with facial recognition, where there is this potential for a loss of anonymity with the databases that we have. And it's not just again mugshots, it's driver's licenses and airport checkout counters and you name it. Quite a vast inventory of information that's available. Body-worn cameras add another dimension to that because the sampling often occurs in communities of color. That's where law enforcement is often very active. That's where body-worn cameras can often be used. So a lot of the collection points on this data is coming from minority communities, and they can be they can oversample essentially in these areas, and that of course feeds into the database that is being assembled, whether local or federal. One check on the ability of law enforcement to deploy body-worn cameras has been the cost, but as with all technology, the costs are rapidly dropping. And so if we're counting on cost as a barrier to forestall the deployment, the widespread use of body-worn cameras, I think we may not be able to count on that much longer. And the cost of facial recognition technology is also rapidly dropping. So as I mentioned earlier, what was once only available at the federal level is increasingly becoming available throughout the country. I mentioned San Francisco. Oregon also has a law. Cincinnati has a similar rule. Handful of jurisdictions, it's very uneven. I do not think Colorado has any such rule barring the use of facial recognition from body-worn cameras. And as I mentioned before, we really are looking at a regulatory void when it comes to body-worn cameras and facial recognition. There are a couple of efforts that have been undertaken to try to put some structure around this. Georgetown Law School drafted model legislation on facial recognition technology, intending to limit who has access to the facial recognition data, when you can expunge that information, how long you can retain it, how law enforcement is trained on that as a tool. It's not been adopted anywhere. There's actually a law student who's now, former law student, who's now a fellow at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She wrote a law review article that I thought was great. It and really proposes some very pragmatic measures that could be undertaken to limit the combination of facial recognition data with body-worn camera imagery. Just basic things similar to the Georgetown legislation, but also providing notice to the communities that are subject to facial recognition technology so that you're even aware that this exists. A lot of people aren't even aware that this is available or out there. And so that notice function, I think, was incredibly insightful. And the other would be to limit the data sharing among law enforcement so that this can't be just swapped and shared and further aggregated, because that aggregation tool, understanding the relationships among images, is really what I think gets at or could potentially compromise our interest in individual privacy and our ability to operate freely within a society. She's also proposed some independent oversight of how that's used. For police, there's often a civilian review board for actions in the field. Maybe there needs to be some kind of civilian review board for how this data is used. And that seems like a pretty prudent maneuver, because we don't fully understand, and very few people have tried to grapple with how law enforcement's using this day to day. So the thing that, and so here you've got her name, Caitlin Ringrose. Again, couldn't recommend this article enough. I thought it was really well done. So you may want to, if you're really interested in the topic, Virginia Law Review, I think the link is available through this presentation, which will be circulated afterward. The thing that really interests me is the data integration bit of it. It's not about any one system. It's not about just location accuracy or just body-worn cameras or toll booth cameras or facial recognition. It's how you knit these things together. And so there's a lot of data out there about you and me. There's consumer information, name, birthplace, current address, all of that sort of thing. There's background checks, credit histories, things like that. And then there's the location data. And it's only been recently that we've seen commercial operators making a business of integrating that data and offering it together. Now, I don't know how many people were doing internet searches in the 80s or in the 90s or into the even the early aughts. But I used to use Ask Jeeves and Lycos and Alta Vista, and they were okay. They weren't great. Ask Jeeves is a great example. The idea behind Ask Jeeves, at least in its initial incarnation, like a lot of other internet companies, they kind of boom and bust, and they reinvented themselves like 80 times. But at one point, the idea was it was going to be your personal butler. They would ask the questions and then try to gather the information for you based on moderators' belief as to what would be the most helpful response. So they would look for the right answer and try to serve that up to you when you did your search. So if you were searching for a definition of the word share, they would look for the best definition out there and then try to serve that to you based on this curation function that they would perform. It actually worked pretty well. It was better than some, but that kind of fell apart in the face of Google. And what Google's genius was really to look at the relationships among data, to look at how often one source is linked to another source. And essentially they crowdsourced that curation function and were able to systematize it in a way that they didn't have to make value judgments about what is right or wrong. They could let the crowd determine the success or the ranking of a given source based on how often it was linked to other sources. And the more reliable sources started to float up to the top of the search. And they've applied similar principles with a lot of different products, and it's all about integrating the relationships and doing that in a way that can readily scale to increase reliability. And so the interesting thing with the government is they have a ton of information on us, and you've got 16 intelligence agencies in the federal government, and each one has their own database, and each one has their own protocols and their layers of classifications and their jurisdictions and their idiosyncratic procedures to access that data. And what we knew from going, leading up to 9/11 was that agencies, or at least after then, we certainly were aware that agencies need to pool that intelligence in order to be to have greater foresight about what's coming and to really be more effective in their jobs. And so one of the big database aggregators that has worked with national security organizations is this company called Palantir. And I don't know how many people are familiar with Palantir or who have read Lord of the Rings. The name might sound familiar because it's I don't know if I'll just go for it. I'm gonna geek out. So
hey Trey.
Yeah,
I don't want to stop the geeking out at all. I think this is a really super interesting presentation. Could you maybe take a couple more minutes just so we save some time for our last one? I think your last point too, as we heard last week in our session around like what can people do and sort of some of the practical pieces.
Yeah.
People are really hungry for.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Let me skip to that, but well, the Palantir were these stones that you look into, and it drove Saruman crazy because they would show you not only truthful things, but they might show you untruthful things, or they might not show you critical information that you needed to make an intelligent decision. And so Palantir is really a database integration utility that combines warrants, arrests, dispatch information, DMV records, all kinds of automatic license plate readers. It can take all of that information and provide it in a graphical user interface that then law enforcement can access and keep drilling down and drilling down and drilling down. And they're now marketing this to local law enforcement. So for example, if you wanted to search for white male, Peckerwood gang, skull tattoo, it's going to go through its records and start searching for that data. And that's never been possible until the emergence of Palantir, and it's all about the relationship matching among the databases. And there's very little in the way, again, of oversight. And we could kind of have a big digression on that. I want to be mindful of the time, though, so I'll let me go cycle through that. But suffice it to say, it's the relationships that really matter, and that really gets makes it a powerful tool. And this is one of the Palantir graphic interface screens. You can do longitudinal tracking. You can click on these links. You can find out who's involved. It's a very, very powerful tool, and it can map the relationships among individuals as well. And that's something that's really quite new, and combined with these other tools makes for a powerful tool. And you still have the same oversampling problem, and you have problems with bad data. It's one person characterized it as bias in, bias out. If you're oversampling in one community, you're going to have a lot more information about that community. Okay, let's talk about fighting back. All right, so before you go to a protest, if you don't want to be known, one thing you should do is enable full disk encryption. iOS, iPhones, they have full disk encryption on by default. Android, you have to work a little harder to do it, but it makes that phone, should it be taken from you, much harder to get into. You should disable Face ID, fingerprint use. You don't want a cop holding up the phone to your face or taking your finger on it and unlocking that, because it's going to have all kinds of information, especially if you have that phone still on. It's recording the entire time effectively, and that can be pretty important for law enforcement and can be used against you should they be able to access that data. Now, we still have, of course, a legal regime that is intended to protect us from that type of unlawful search or unwarranted search and seizure. But these are precautions that may be warranted if you don't entirely trust law enforcement to always observe those safeguards. Signal is an end-to-end encrypted messaging tool. It's available on a desktop. It's available by over an app. It is much harder to break into, and in fact, when Parler on the right-wing side, when Parler was shut down, a lot of the traffic from the fringe moved to Signal because it's very difficult to and Telegraph and other similar platforms, very difficult to penetrate, highly encrypted, very secure, and it doesn't store a lot of data. So it is, it's a very robust and private way to communicate, and quite helpful. Notifications, if you're like me and you're on this call, there are all these notifications coming up, text, emails, phone calls. If your phone's lying on the ground and law enforcement sees that somebody's called you, or protest is moving to this location, that location, could come in quite handy. So you might want to turn those notifications off. Backing up data, always a good practice, especially going into a protest where your phone could be damaged, taken. Another would be to enable airplane mode. We talked about that. A lot of the tracking, the tracing, the surveillance, it's just not going to happen if you're not connected to the larger network. So disabling that network access, going into airplane mode, could still use your camera. You could use the video camera feature, but you're going to avoid that risk. Also, just as a practice, it's going to save your battery, because if you're gathering at a place where it's very crowded and there are lots of people all vying to access the network, your little phone is going to be working really hard to try to establish a signal and maintain that signal to the base station, and it's going to chew through your battery really quickly. So it's probably good, even if you're not concerned about security, it's just going to preserve the life of your phone. And then turn it on if and when you need it. Another foolproof way to do it would be to use a prepaid phone. You can go to, depends on the jurisdiction. A lot of jurisdictions do not require any ID to buy a prepaid phone. You go to the little kiosk, you grab one out of there for 20 bucks, use it all day. It's not traced to you. Very difficult to push that back to you. Again, rules vary by state. I have to confess, I haven't looked up Colorado, so I'm not entirely sure whether an ID is required there. It does vary. All right, during a protest, don't drive. Automatic license plate readers are increasingly common. If you're concerned about law enforcement tracking your whereabouts, these things are deployed widely, and you're much better walking. Don't wear your Viking horns to the protest. They're going to pick you out. Cover identifying features. We really haven't talked a lot about facial recognition, but the more the face that can be seen, the easier it is to identify you. Sunglasses, masks, these sorts of things are probably good ideas. We saw a fair amount of that even during the Capitol riots, just maybe not as much as was necessary to really evade law enforcement. And it's interesting, in the Capitol riots, law enforcement, if you're following the stories, they are using a lot of these tools. They are using data from Wi-Fi hotspots to identify who was in the Capitol, because when you walk in the Capitol, you're inside a granite encased building. There's no cell phone coverage, or it's very poor. The signals from outside don't penetrate inside. So we can't use GPS, we can't use triangulation from base stations, but we've got all these repeaters inside the building, and now we can know who's inside, who's outside, and law enforcement is using that. They're using facial recognition technology, or in that case, crowdsourcing for identity. There are a couple of technologies that are marketed online if you're really into it. There's sunglasses that are supposed to block, like reflect back into a camera, kind of with a bright light so they can't really see it. They do appear to work. They're not foolproof, but that's kind of interesting. There's another tool, like before you post a photo of yourself, that can remove a certain number of pixels from your image. Your face will still be recognizable, but according to this sort of online Fox mask, it takes out enough pixels that the algorithms can't quite get a handle on your face is different from another face. And so that's kind of interesting. It's still, I'm not convinced on that entirely, but it's an interesting little sidelight. One thing that I have seen marketed is over a license plate, you're supposed to be able to spray a certain marketed product. It's like a paint spray. It's not actually paint though, it's clear. It's supposed to do the same thing that those sunglasses do, reflect back light into the license plate readers. Universally panned, doesn't work, don't waste your money. Okay, after
Trey, I am so sorry.
I'm sorry. I probably
you have such good information, and it pains me to cut you off. Any final thoughts as we make the transition to our last speaker today with Jason?
No, I think, look, there's no good or bad technology. There's just technology. It's really about how you use it. But I think everyone deserves to know what the risks are and how it works. And then you can take precautions against that. And I think we should all, my view, be working to make people more aware so that we can approach this technology intelligently and with a degree of oversight that we really don't have today.
Great. And we will make sure to make your slides available to everyone who might have some follow-up questions, and acknowledging sort of the conversation in the chat. Just kind of want to be mindful of everyone's time today. So thank you so much, Trey. This was really great.
You're quite welcome.
Okay, thank you. All right, so everyone, we're gonna quickly pop over to Jason. I will make this quick in terms of introducing him. So our fourth presentation today is Jason Van Anden. He is the founder and chief technologist of the social justice app company Quadrant 2. Quadrant 2 Incorporated has created software for some of the most recognized brands in the world. I'm Getting Arrested, Stop and Frisk Watch, and Policy Bystander apps are just a few of the ways they have bridged the gap between technology and social justice. So with that, I will hand it off to Jason.
Hi all. Thanks so much for having me. I've got my Daniel is over there. He's gonna be presenting the slides. So great. Okay. So yeah. So thanks for having me. I want to give you a little bit of background on Quadrant 2. So Quadrant 2 is a 25-year-old company, and we kind of I've always been very politically active. In 2011, I created an app in order to participate in the Occupy Wall Street movement. It was called the I'm Getting Arrested app, and it was the first panic button type app. And I developed it as a quick way for organizers to, or for protesters to alert loved ones or their lawyer or an organization in the event that they were arrested. It was interesting at the time. I was living in New York City and I wanted to participate in the Occupy protest, but we had an infant at home and my wife was teaching, and so we like say, so in a couple of evenings I created the app and I just made it available and immediately went viral, and it's used around the world still in demonstrations. Originally we wrote the app so that it would use, and so at that point what was funny is that different organizations started to reach out to Quadrant 2 to see if we could come up with other solutions, and we're best known for 3 different solutions. And Daniel, if you want to switch to the next slide real quick. Okay, so we're known for 3 solutions that we've come up with, but we've developed many more. We've turned our the I'm Getting Arrested app into an alerts platform, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. We've also created, because of the I'm Getting Arrested app, the New York Civil Liberties Union asked us to, if we could create like originally a panic button app for stop and frisk in New York City. And I recommended that instead of somebody reaching into their pocket to trigger a panic button, which could be dangerous under those circumstances, that we should use the camera on the phone. We ended up creating the first police video bystander app, which was called Stop and Frisk Watch in 2012. And it was interesting because it sort of opened the public's eyes to the idea that they could actually take video of the officers as citizens of what was happening around them. Our video platforms have been used all around the world at this point, and I'm going to speak a little bit mostly about mobile justice and our video platforms and let you know about that. The third platform that we've created is we've created an AI-enabled chatbot for the organization United for Respect. We created this in 2016 as a, Walmart doesn't have a union, but a lot of people were asking the types of questions that they might ask union reps online on Facebook groups. So United for Respect came to us and asked, could we help with this problem? And we ended up developing, at the time, one of the very first AI chatbots, where someone can ask a question in natural language, and if the AI was able to interpret the question and match it to a answer that was asked before, it would do so, and if not, I would forward the message to a volunteer peer who could look up the answer, dialogue with the user, and give them the answer, at which point that would be synthesized into the AI for subsequent requests. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is our bystander video platform. And as we all know, so, the video platform we have right now is probably best known under the name Mobile Justice, which is the platform that the ACLU uses. Like I say, we have a variety of different ways of offering this type of video platform to different groups and organizations. So clearly, the problem is that communities have lost their trust in institutions who are sworn to protect them, and they don't feel heard. And we saw this in a big way over the last, we've seen this in the last year, especially with all the BLM protests and demonstrations over the George Floyd killing. Next slide. Okay, so we basically created ways in which organizations or people on the ground can document what they're seeing and report it to authorities in a trusted way. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of the features of what this technology does. Firstly, all of our technologies are anonymous. We allow all of our technologies to be anonymous in the same way that Signal is anonymous. So there's never a registration with any of our products unless the client wants it, but all of our products can be loaded anonymously and used without exposing identity. Okay, so the first and most important feature that we have in our technology with the bystanders platforms is that we record live video instantly and off the phone. So what happens is as you're recording, we actually stream the video off the phone if there's an internet connection, so that the evidence of what's happening gets recorded off the phone. We also stream the video to emergency contacts that you can set up beforehand. And the idea here is that not only is there accountability in terms of the video going securely to a trusted broker, but there's a copy of it that someone who doesn't have the phone also can witness in real time, or have a copy of later. So there's a way of ensuring that the content that was recorded off the phone was genuine and instant and coming from the lens of that device. The technology is actually a little bit more, the technology is insanely robust in that if there is no internet connection, the video will record locally on the device. Without having to communicate to the user, if there's any dropouts, those will be synced later. So in other words, you don't have to worry about whether or not you have access to Wi-Fi or the internet at all. The videos will instantly record when you're using our technologies, and they'll always end up where they need to be, assuming eventually there is an internet connection. Okay. Another aspect of all of our technologies is that we always include push notifications in all of our technologies, including the bystanders platform. So what this means is, looks like we lost slides. So what this means is that what it means is that you can very rapidly communicate with people who have these apps installed in a way that's unobtrusive and outside of, let's say, the noisier channels that they might otherwise be listening to. Because these are one-way channels, it's kind of nice because you can send directives to people through this network. And we've built all kinds of interesting features into this technology so that you can actually send notifications directly to people based on where they are or what language they speak. Again, we build everything with privacy, with the utmost respect to privacy. So what's interesting about our location feature, for instance, is that we broadcast and have the phone check where you are in order to determine if it should present the notification or not, as opposed to tracking where you are to determine whether or not we should show the notification. And now I am without my slides, but that's okay. Let me just see. Yeah. Okay. Might feel a little better without them, so I'm going to continue on. Okay. So another feature in this technology is that we've built, whether we have both a, okay, so this is just, okay, there we go, we're back. Okay. Again, the whole idea behind this tech is that someone can instantly record what's going on, right? And the videos will come in and they arrive at a trusted broker, a trusted person who can then broker the information in some way. This is just showing us the emergency contact screen, which again, what this allows the user to do is to enter phone numbers or email addresses of people they would want to be their witness of the event, and they'll get a link sent to them instantly once recording starts, and they can evaluate the video in real time when they click on the link. Next slide. Okay, so this is everything, this technology has evolved since 2012. So this is all evolved out of the stop and frisk watch apps. At this point, what's interesting is that we have a portal that the organization receiving the videos can privately, view and determine, if an event is actionable, and then manage, that content through a workflow that's built into the technology. Next slide. Okay, so, this is just showing, again, over time, we've learned what people need. And so we have very sophisticated workflow features built into the platform at this point, including things like creating collections of videos that are important or organized in a particular way. Next slide. Okay, and as I was explaining before with the pictures of the phones, we have a way of the push notification. What's the push notification feature of what we do to me is invaluable and underutilized often. So this is yeah, I see someone's mentioning Notifica, and what's interesting is that we created Notifica is actually is an interesting app, and it came out around the same time that we provided Migracam to the ACLU of Texas, which does a lot of these, does the notifications, but also does the this notion of video. So they're very similar ideas. So next slide, Daniel. Okay. Let's see. So is the format of this that people will post questions in the chat, or will someone post a message directly to me? Because I could take a few questions if someone's interested in asking them.
Yeah, why don't we, there is a question for you, Jason, until we get your slides back. So just a question about where people can get these apps and the cost of them.
Yeah, so the apps cost, it depends on the type of situation. So we have an app called Xharra, which can be used which we built so that smaller organizations and groups can instantly have the same superpowers as one of the white labeled versions. The white labeled versions are a bit more expensive. We have one municipality right now that's interested, has engaged us to create our first municipality version. And the idea was that activists were demanding that there be police accountability through an app like this, and they reached out and we said, yeah, of course we can do that, because that's what we do. So that'll be released in the next month. Again, a white labeled solution is definitely a bit more involved and more expensive solution. We also have a product called Xharra. Xharra allows an organization to quickly sign up, and frankly, they could be sending out, they could be collecting videos from the field almost instantly, once they sign up. The subscription for Xharra, again, it depends on if it's a monthly thing or if it's an annual subscription. So the prices could range from let's say $3,500 a month to $20,000 a year for that. And what Xharra is that it's a shared platform. The same features on the back end exist for organizing and receiving the video content. But your way of distributing it is less complicated. You send out a deep link. When people click on the link, the Xharra app becomes the dedicated camera that'll record everything that people need. Again, for the municipalities, we're not entirely clear about what the pricing should be yet, because we have sort of our pilot municipality onboarding this month. So if that helps. I was going to show you another app that we have, but I could take some questions about mobile justice and the bystanders platforms.
Great, yeah. So would invite anybody to kind of chat their questions or raise their hand as they come to you. I'm not sure where. Oh, how do you spell Xharra?
So if you look up Xharra, you can. So what's interesting about the Xharra app is that it's really meant for organizations. So if you install the Xharra app, it just records video. It doesn't really do anything with it. But if you if you're an organization that wants to use Xharra, you can get in touch with Quadrant 2. We'll set you up with the portal. You can do a trial, and you can, like I say, you can send a link to people either publicly that you want to record on your behalf, or only to people that you want to privately invite, and they can record video. The other app that I was going to talk about, and I have some slides for, and I was also going to do a demo I was going to do a demo of the video platform, but until that comes back, let me talk a little bit about prompt. So in 2011, we created, like I say, the first panic button app, which was called I'm Getting Arrested. We developed it for Occupy Wall Street. Earlier this year, a friend of mine who's a journalist reached out and said, hey, where's the I'm Getting Arrested app? Why can't we use it anymore? It was great, and they need it in Portland right now. So so we immediately we're like, okay, the reason we took the I'm Getting Arrested app down was because When we originally wrote it, it used SMS, and we wanted to make an app. The different parameters that we used for for creating I'm Getting Arrested was, I wanted to make something that people could use, that they could trust, and that could be free instantly. So I wanted to make something very quickly. It was like classic rapid response. So, so by using the SMS on the Android phones, we were able to make it completely free because, you know, we had no network. We were using the SMS to send the messages of the user's phone. It was kind of crazy that we were allowed to actually use SMS in this way, because in hindsight, we were asking people for both their contact list and their SMS. And there's a lot of abuse that we could have done with them, or anyone could do with that. So now in 2020, you know, of course, those things are blocked by Google and whatnot. So we were trying to think of, well, how can we offer the same thing without having to pay Twilio, essentially, to enable the same functionality? What we came up with is that we created I'll share my screen. We created it's a peer-to-peer alert system that uses the same idea as I'm Getting Arrested. The app's called Prompt. I can't really see it that well. And what you do, you can get this from the store now, is that you create a message. Oops. Okay. Okay. You create a message and you create a deep link. When you share this link, you can either share it through a link or you can share it through a QR code. When other people scan that link, they subscribe to a channel that you can send messages directly to. And so the version that's on, I hesitate to mention this because the version that's on the store, we're about to add a new feature to, which is going to make it a lot more robust. But right now we have a pilot that you can go to the app and Play stores and use right now. And the idea with this is that, so once you set up your message, just like with I'm Getting Arrested, you click and hold the target and it sends the message right out. And so what's nice about this is that it allowed us to create this, allowed us to enable this technology for free, completely anonymous, okay? And you're not limited by how many phone numbers. Anybody who clicks on the link will receive that message from the person who sent it. Okay, so this is really super powerful in that. So like I say, it's a very interesting solution for both reporting and any kind of alert that you'd want to send. You can now send for free to as many people as you might need to receive that alert. And this is something, like I say, we're in a beta period right now. We have a version that would allow like a larger organization to manage multiple message channels that like I say, that I can't show you because I don't have my deck. So, all right, any questions? So the one that I just showed you is called Prompt. And if you Google Prompt Quadrant 2, or if you go to the Play or App stores and you look up Prompt Quadrant 2, like I say, this is a beta version. If you follow up with me, I'd love to give you a more thorough presentation of just that. Like that, we are, you know, the video platform is very robust. It's very complete. And it's very off the shelf at this point right now. Prompt is really the thing that I'm most excited about in terms of enabling people to send these messages en masse without anonymously in this immediate way. Any other questions? No.
Any other final questions as we have Jason? And I'm hoping, Jason, we can get your slides and share with the group so that we can.
Yeah, we have some demo videos. So if the group isn't interested,
yeah,
that I could I can send that as a follow-up.
That's perfect. Yeah, seeing some chatter and appreciation for what you've done and for the slides to come. So if anybody else has any other final thoughts, All right, Jason, thank you so much. Really interesting. Thank you for your work. And I will just toss it quickly back to Tim to close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Jason, for your time. Really appreciate that. And thanks for everybody for being here today. Just wanted to thank you again. Keep in mind as we're going through all these tools, you know, there were a lot mentioned today: Sprinkler, Tableau, Curate, Airtable. You know, think about if those could be something you could use in your organization. And we've got this grant that's coming up at the end of next week. Speaking of next week is going to be about storytelling, about media strategies, interview techniques, data collection, and surveys. So really appreciate your time today. Look forward to seeing you next week. And thanks to Jill and Cynthia again for making all this possible.
Our pleasure. Can't hear anybody. Jill?
Yeah, I'm gonna sign off. I think there are a couple of people still in the hanging out. So we'll talk soon.
It was very interesting. I really liked it. A lot of interest in all the panelists. Really like that.
Yeah, I think everybody would like to they would have loved to stick with that digital security one a lot longer.
Yes.
Like Trey's really good, and I felt bad because that, like, we had more time this time than last time, but still not enough time. And I think the Q&A would have been fantastic on that.
True.
Yeah, good engagement all day and great presentations.
Yes.
So, all right, well, we'll have a good weekend, and I guess you want to do the same thing as last week, check in maybe on Wednesday?
Yes.
And yeah, I'll send you all the feedback that I get. I'll look at that today or tomorrow and get that to you over the weekend.
Perfect. Sounds good. Yeah, have a great weekend, and we'll talk next week.
All right, thanks again for your efforts on this. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, take care.